Hello, Pittsburgh. I'm Zac Gibson, and this is TribLive's From the Newsroom Podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. Penguins head coach Mike Sullivan stood at the lectern in a cramped media room at the UPMC Lemieux Sports Complex in Cranberry and offered a terse but direct response when asked about his future. "My intentions are to be the head coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins," end quote, Sullivan said on April 18th, a day after the 2024-25 season concluded. 10 days later, on Monday, Sullivan and the Penguins agreed to part ways, ending the most successful tenure of any coach in the franchise's 57-year history. Sullivan, a mid-season hire during the 2015-16 season, leaves as the Penguins' winningest coach and the leader of consecutive Stanley Cup championships. TribLive sports reporters have followed Sullivan and the Penguins throughout their time together. Jonathan Bombulie is here today to discuss the career, feats, and potential future of Coach Sullivan. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So at the top of this episode, I want to mention, because it is an important part of everyone's stories today, at the time of recording this, April 30th, this was not the original setup that we were going to have. We were going to have myself introducing and producing this episode, but you and Seth as the host for this episode.
Yeah, I think Seth is dealing with something that a lot of our listeners are dealing with this week, in the sense that his mother's house has a tree on it last time I spoke to him. So he's dealing with that. I said, no problem. I can fill in. I can talk about Mike Sullivan. When I started with the Trib was like roughly within a few months of when Mike Sullivan started coaching the Penguins. So I feel like I was there for a lot of the trajectory of his coaching career.
All right. So let's get right into this conversation. Let's look back at this Mike Sullivan era with the Penguins. So how would you sum up Mike Sullivan's time as the head coach? What's his legacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, I think you can comfortably call him the best head coach in Penguins history, because he won the 2 Stanley Cups, and it's also, he coached a 10-year tenure. The other people that would be in that conversation, Badger Bob Johnson is a beloved franchise icon who won the Stanley Cup in 1991, but he only coached for 1 year. And they tragically died after that. And Scotty Bowman, who replaced him and won the 1992 Stanley Cup, and also coached in 93, which was a great Penguins team. He only coached for 2 years. I mean, he's one of the greatest coaches in the NHL of all time. But when you look at the 10 years, 1 year and 2 years, it might be difficult to put them in that pantheon. But I mean, look, that's the 3 we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Mike Sullivan with 2, all-time greats. So he's in the conversation. It wouldn't shock me at all if he ends up in the Hall of Fame when his career is over, especially if he wins a gold medal.
Absolutely.
Coaching for the United States, because I mean, he's a big part of USA hockey in addition to what he's done in the NHL. 2 cups and a gold medal, that'll get you in the Hall of Fame. So, his tenure is among the best.
Okay. So within this tenure, what would you say for the Penguins has been his best coaching season? Or was there any moments that really made him shine out to you as a reporter?
Sure. I think it starts with that first year. I mean, he won the Stanley Cup in his first and second year, and that was obviously the highlights of his tenure. But what happened in those 2 seasons, I think, gives a pretty good picture of why he was such a good coach. Because the seasons when he replaced Mike Johnston, who was an unsuccessful coach for about 1.5 years, and he was kind of professorial, and his tactics were less aggressive, and when Mike Sullivan came in, he ramped up the speed and aggressiveness of the style of play. And at the same time, Jim Rutherford was the general manager at the time. He made some pretty drastic changes to the roster that worked hand in glove with the way Mike Sullivan liked to coach. So like within days of Mike Sullivan getting promoted to that job, Jim Rutherford traded Rob Scuderi for Trevor Daley to Chicago. Rob Scuderi was a cerebral, steady, stay-at-home type of defenseman who, defended well, blocked shots. But, what kind of player am I describing? A conservative defensive player.
Yep,
he traded for Trevor Daley, who is also a defenseman, but he's known for his skating ability. He's known for how fast he is, and how he can get involved in the rush, become a more offensive player. So around that same time, they brought in Carl Hagelin, who was a critical part of those teams, and he's one of the fastest skaters in the league. Then they also called up a series of players from Wilkes-Barre younger guys, Connor Sherry and Brian Rust and Scott Wilson and Tom Kuhnhackl. And in addition to goalie Matt Murray, but that doesn't fit into the speed that we're talking about here. But so Rutherford brings in a handful of guys who are known for their speed, and Sullivan's style is an aggressive forecheck. It puts pressure on opposing defenses. It makes them make quick decisions. It makes them skate, and it's a style of play that it also worked well with the Penguins stars at the time, because you're talking about, obviously Sidney Crosby is the number one guy, and speed is one of, especially in 2016, was one of his greatest attributes, and he
Absolutely.
loved that style of play. Like, he loved to press the pace and create offense and to create turnovers and defend by being in the other end of the ice. The best defense is a good offense in this case.
Right.
So Evgeny Malkin liked to play like that. Phil Kessel was on those teams, and Phil Kessel was a interesting character and everything like that. But one thing he could do was fly. I mean, he could skate. So the everything came together. He was the right guy with the right general manager, and they put together a style of play that the league hadn't seen a lot of at that point. Now, that's changed. Now, a lot of people play that way now. But at the time, perfect guy for the situation. And he came in and did the job. And I mean, winning back-to-back championships, like in the salary cap era, it's very rare.
Absolutely.
Because the salary cap is designed to promote parity. It's designed to keep the talent levels equal across the league. So winning 2 in a row hadn't been done in the salary cap era before the Penguins did it. So, I mean, what did Mike Sullivan do best? And I think the answer is bring that speed and aggressiveness that really hadn't been seen a whole lot before, especially in the 2 previous years' Penguin seasons.
Okay. So let's take a look at the other side. What do you think are some of the biggest shortcomings or beginnings when it came to the decline in this era?
Well, to me, the biggest, the number one reason for the fact that the Penguins haven't made the playoffs in the last 3 years, I mean, that's emblematic of the decline we're talking about. Part of it just has to do with the passage of time. I mean, Sidney Crosby had a great year. One of the best years a 37-year-old has ever had in the NHL. But I mean, a 37-year-old isn't a 23-year-old. Like it's just time moves on. So Evgeny Malkin's seen decline, and Chris Letang has seen decline, and so there was a natural sort of ebbs and flows of things, and your best players get older, and you sort of you take a little bit of a step back. But a big part of it also is, I talked about the speed and aggressiveness with the tactics that he brought. Well, I mean, professional sports are really a copycat kind of business. So if one team has success playing a particular style, you see this across all sports, then other teams are going to emulate that. So, the Penguins played a speed game. Well, within a few years, everybody was playing a speed game. And it's easier for guys in their 20s to play the speed game than guys in their 30s. So
Absolutely.
So everybody sort of caught up a little bit. And to me, when you look at like these 3 seasons that they didn't make the playoffs, to me, there's a little bit of a difference between the seasons before that. You got the cup years, and then you got the years they made the playoffs but didn't advance much. They won 1 series against the Flyers, but that was it. And then they had first round losses to the Islanders and the Rangers. So that's like the made the playoffs, didn't get anywhere era. And then there's the didn't make the playoffs era. So it's kind of like 3 separate things.
Okay.
And to me, what you see in this most recent 3-year stretch where they haven't made the playoffs is the defense has gotten worse. And in zone defense and decision making with the puck has gotten worse. And Mike Sullivan talks about it all the time. And you referenced his postseason remarks to reporters. One of the things he said about what they needed to improve on was they needed to have a more defensive mentality. Like, he thinks it's not a matter of personnel. That could be debated. Did they have enough personnel to play good defense? You could debate that topic. But what he says is that it's a mindset that you have to be able to, just defend defending is a conscious decision, right? And that anybody can make that decision, and that his team really didn't do enough of that. And to me, that's an indication that his message, and when you look at the product on the ice and don't see that, it's an indication that his message isn't getting through as well as it once did.
Okay.
And I will tell you this. I don't think that's a knock against Mike Sullivan or even necessarily a knock against the players. I think it's just in hockey especially, there's a staleness that develops when a coach has been in one place for a long time. And I was telling you this before we started recording. In the NHL, the average coach's tenure is 2.3 seasons, which is like a blink of an eye if you really think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the coaches before Mike Sullivan, they parted ways. I used air quotes, they parted ways. But you look at Mike Tomlin, look at Derek Shelton. These are coaches that have tenures, way over 2.3 seasons, right?
Absolutely.
So the fact that hockey just recycles coaches like crazy. As soon as the coach's message gets stale, boom, in hockey, they get rid of him. The average tenure in the NBA and NFL and Major League Baseball is over 4 years. So it's almost twice as long. So the fact that Mike Sullivan lasted 10 years is a bit of an upset. And the fact that it ended like it did, it really isn't shocking if you look at the overall way things go in hockey. And it's just part of the culture.
Yeah, things are bound to get stale in a way.
Things are bound to get stale. And also, culturally, owners and general managers are willing to just turn coaches over like crazy. It's part of the way things are done in the NHL as opposed to other sports. And so eventually that caught up with Mike Sullivan.
Okay. Well, you mentioned a lot of big names, and obviously Sullivan coached some huge ones, Crosby, Malkin, Letang. So how have you seen his management style work with these names, these star power over the years?
It's interesting because I thought when I first started covering Mike Sullivan, I thought his greatest sort of attribute was the way he dealt with young players. And let me tell you a little story. It's one of the favorite things I ever wrote about Mike Sullivan. Coaches, when they get to become established coaches, they have like sort of an area of expertise that they'll lecture on. Like, so, in the off season, you'll have a coaching clinic.
Right.
And so, and you see this in football, like a football coach will give a seminar about the, Tampa 2 or the, blitz schemes, something that they specialize in.
Right.
So Mike Sullivan was giving a lecture at a coaching seminar, I think it was sponsored by USA Hockey. And his area of expertise was how hockey players learn. And he talked about how the brain works. And he was talking about, I think it was called myelin, but it's a chemical in the brain that allows pathways to develop for your, with like synapses and things. I'm doing a bad job of explaining it because I wrote it a long time ago. I don't remember exactly the details of it, but he was talking about like the chemistry in the brains of hockey players and how they learn things. So his premise was that to make hockey players learn, they had to hit an obstacle and then they had to learn how to overcome that obstacle. And that wasn't just a matter of, teaching like a coach teaches tactics.
Right.
That was wiring their brains, their physical brain chemistry to learn how to overcome obstacles. And I just thought, I'd never heard a hockey coach talk like that before. And I thought it was really fascinating. And to take a little bit of a tangent, one of the dangers, I'm sure we'll get into something along these lines, of firing Mike Sullivan. I use firing because it feels more like a firing than a parting of ways. One of the dangers is the next coach you bring in is probably not going to be as innovative. He's probably not going to be as cerebral. He's probably not going to be as quote unquote good of a hockey coach. So that would make me uncomfortable if I was a GM, saying like, why am I going to, the moment I get rid of Mike Sullivan, I'm looking for the next Mike Sullivan.
Right.
So it's not a matter of the next guy's going to be better. The next guy's just going to be different. So they'd reached a point where different was important. And so, I'm not sitting here killing Kyle Dubas for this situation. I understand it. Different was a necessity, but I don't know that you're necessarily going to get better. But so when I learned all that stuff about the way he focuses on learning and teaching, and I thought that his strengths would be working with young players. And it was in the early days, but there was much less of that as his tenure went on. And there's lots of reasons for that. One is the biggest one is that they didn't have prospects as good as they did back then, because when you have a period of success, you draft lower in the draft and you don't get as good prospects coming into your system.
Right.
And the first crop of guys, he gave them young guys, he gave them lots of responsibility because he trusted them because he needed them, to change the culture, and because they were good quality prospects. And you got fewer of that as he went on, and it was to his detriment, because that young infusion of youth is something that every team needs in all sports, but especially hockey, where the young legs are so important.
Absolutely.
So I think he got he sort of got away from that. But in terms of dealing to your original question, I've gone on a tangent here.
No, you're fine. Absolutely.
Dealing with star players. To me, the best indication that he was good at that too is that Sidney Crosby swears by the guy. Evgeny Malkin likes the guy. Chris Letang only says good things about the guy. I mean, so these are the biggest of star players. And I think he had a good way when you're a coach at a high level, like, professional sports, you can't, I think there's an idea that maybe you should treat everyone the same. And that doesn't work. You have to treat everyone fairly, but you can't treat everyone the same. So there are times where guys that have high-end abilities get more of a leash to make mistakes. And I think Mike Sullivan believed that. And I think veteran players appreciated that. And I think he just did right by veteran players. He gave them the respect. To me, Sidney Crosby deserves so much respect for the way he plays and the way he carries himself and the way he's the things he's done for the team and the things he's done for the city. And I think Mike Sullivan, agreed with that and treated him that way. And that's how it has to be done. I mean, the idea of everyone being treated the same might sound great on paper, but it just doesn't work in reality. And I think that, Sidney Crosby also is never going to take advantage of that situation. Some players might. That's just not in his way of doing things. So that's why that relationship between those two guys worked out really well. And it does make you wonder. It's one of the big questions coming out of this situation is, obviously Sidney Crosby's not going to come out and say, I'm opposed to this decision. It's just not in his nature to do that. Kyle Dubas screwed up. Hi, I'm Sidney Crosby. Kyle Dubas screwed up.
Right.
He's never going to say that. But it does make you wonder if he's only got a few years left. And it makes you wonder if he wants to break in a new coach. I kind of suspect that he doesn't.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but I also kind of suspect that he saw the staleness, and he's always been good about that. He also, every time they've gotten rid of a coach, whether it was Dan Bylsma or Michael Therrien or even Mike Johnston, who wasn't very successful, Sidney Crosby talks about how the players internalize that, or at least he does. To be like, this guy lost his job because we weren't as good as we could have been.
Yeah.
And, that's an interesting way. I don't think all players feel that way, but Sidney Crosby does. And it's an interesting perspective.
Very interesting. Now, in part of your answer, you did talk about the way that Sullivan worked with younger talent. And that was part of my next question. So I will just have you a quick rehash and a little bit added onto it. How, in recent seasons, with his work with unproven talent, how do you think he handled the development of those younger players?
Well, he hasn't put young players in important roles like he did in 15, 16, and 17. And I think part of that is necessity. Like, those young players with their youth and sort of enthusiasm were exactly what that team needed in 15 through 17. I don't think Mike Sullivan necessarily felt that that's what that wasn't necessarily what they needed at this point. And also that it just wasn't the caliber of player. Like, we're talking about Brian Rust and Jake Gensel. Like, those are two of the guys that came in Sullivan's early days. Well, Gensel has moved on. He's been traded, but he's like a 40-goal scorer. Brian Rust scored 30 goals this year. Like, at the time, we just thought that they were kids coming up from Wilkes-Barre. We don't, you can't really tell them apart, right? I mean, it's just kids coming up from Wilkes-Barre. But in hindsight, he had really good young players to put in those situations. They haven't produced a guy like that in a while. Now, at the end of this season, they called up a couple of kids from Wilkes-Barre, Ville Koivunen and Rutger McGroarty, who are pretty good prospects. Actually, Koivunen came over in the Gensel trade. So when they traded away Gensel, they get a guy like this, and he's a really good prospect, Finnish kid who has scored at every level he's played at. Rutger McGroarty is a first-round draft pick, high first-round draft pick that they traded for. And those two guys, Sullivan did give them the kind of responsibility and ice time that he gave those kids in the early years. And
Okay.
so I think he was starting to come to the realization that the inclusion of those kids was going to be an important part of bringing this team around. But now he's not going to get that chance, obviously. And,
Right.
and I mean, I really think that sort of reading between the lines of what Kyle Dubas said at his press conference after Sullivan was let go, the impression I get is that Sullivan was more focused on, he thought that the rebuild that the Penguins are in didn't have to take another couple of years.
Okay.
That they could maybe go aggressively try to acquire a couple of players and contend, boom, just like that, contend this season, upcoming next season. And I think Kyle Dubas sort of approaches it more holistically. Like he doesn't want to just sort of, piecemeal together a couple of guys and sneak into the playoffs.
Right.
He wants to build, keep acquiring draft picks, keep acquiring prospects, maybe make some trades to acquire young NHL players. He doesn't want any more guys in their 30s. He has enough of those guys.
Right.
He wants, if he can get a 23-year-old NHL player, he'll get a 23-year-old. So I think that the fundamental, it's not like it's not like a terrible disagreement between general manager and coach. We've seen those in sports history.
Absolutely.
It's sort of a mild, just sort of different takes on where they are in their life cycle.
Right.
And I think Sullivan was like, let's go sign a free agent and try to win, because he's a competitive guy and he's a coach and he wants to win. And Kyle Dubas, the GM, is like, let's kind of take it slow, build for another year, and then try to, sort of organically move back into contention and not just sneak into the playoffs contention, but, vie for a Stanley Cup contention. I think that was the difference that ultimately led to the divorce.
Okay. Well, we'll move on a little bit from the intermechanics of this Sullivan legacy and taking a larger view. So in your time reporting, I'm sure you've gotten to hear just the Pittsburgh take on Mike Sullivan. So how do the fans and the players view his time in Pittsburgh? Was he more beloved or respected, or were fans more recently looking for a change?
Yeah, both. I think definitely the prevailing sentiment after he was let go was this was a necessary change. This was an overdue change. I know a lot of fans feel that way. I don't necessarily feel that way, but I know a lot of fans do. But they also absolutely 100% respect what he did for the franchise and winning those 2 championships. Because you really have to, if you take a minute, Crosby and Malkin came in together basically in 04, 05, 06. And they won the one champ. They went to the Stanley Cup Finals in 08 and lost, and then came back in 09 and won.
Okay.
And so, that was great. They won their championship. But then you're looking at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 6 years where they had just playoff disappointments, injuries, all kinds of sort of things that went awry. 6 years, that's a long time.
Absolutely.
In hockey time, in a hockey player's career.
Mm-hmm.
Most players, that's half their career. And most players, that's their whole career.
Yeah.
But star players, that's half their career, third of their career. So, and if that had been the end of it, if in 2015, a general manager had broken it up, if Ray Shero or Jim Rutherford had traded Malkin, traded Letang, blew it up and started over, I don't think any GM in their right mind would have ever traded Crosby. If Crosby and Malkin's legacy was they won 1 championship together, it would almost be seen as disappointing. That sounds crazy because winning a championship is hard.
Right.
And going to the finals twice in a row is really hard. And they're both
seeing the full what it is now.
Yeah, like that they almost would have been, these two came in with such fanfare and they only won us 1 ring. Now they won 3 rings and their legacy is unassailable.
Absolutely.
I mean, nobody can ever say that they didn't fulfill their expectations. They fulfilled it and then some. And I think people appreciate Mike Sullivan's role in that for sure. So it's funny. If you had like a public opinion poll about Mike Sullivan, his approval rating, like you'd have for a politician, 2 weeks ago, it would have been real low because people are like, his time's over. They haven't made the playoffs in 3 years. Today, it would probably be real high because I think now that he's out of the picture, people sort of look back fondly on what he did. I think Yeah, I mean, like, someday when he's retired and he comes back for the 50th anniversary of the 2016 Cup or something like that, he'll be revered like with the upper echelon of guys in the franchise. But 2 weeks ago, people were like, "Hey, let's get this bum out of here." That's just how it goes. I you know what? I don't think he'd even be offended by that. Coaches know that's how it goes. I mean, I remember talking to him one time about the shelf life of NHL coaches and how short it is. And he lamented it. He said he didn't think that was necessarily the best for, just for developing teams.
Right.
But he said he gets it. Like, you're hired to be fired. I mean, believe me, he's not, I don't think he's crying himself to sleep at night. He's got, first of all, he's a well-respected coach that's probably going to have people beating down his door to hire him. But if he just wanted to sit at home and go fishing every day and play golf and I think he and his family like to play spike ball or pickleball, something like that. He could do that for 2 years and still make, because he had 2 years left on his deal. So he could sit there and make like, I don't know, $11 million or $13 million over 2 years, just kind of hanging out. He's a really competitive guy. I don't think he'll do that, but I think he wants to get back into the fight, but he could do that. It would be, I don't know, that would be an attractive offer to me. I don't know. That's what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's leading right into my next section here. As we get closer to the end, I want to look a little bit about the timing of this split. We've talked about it a lot, but do you think this was the right decision for right now? I'm sure there have been a lot that have said it's been time. Obviously, this is a very long career to be in one position. A lot of people might say maybe give him a few more years to build, as he was just seeming to start that development in this stage. But what do you think when it comes to this year being the year that it was the end for Mike Sullivan with the Penguins?
I do think the next 3 years are going to be better than the last 3 years, just because of the sort of cycle. Like I said, talk about this life cycle, and they're adding good young players right now.
Absolutely.
And those players, as they mature, they've got good young goaltenders coming in. That's always important. I think the next coach is probably, I wouldn't say the next coach is like, this isn't the greatest job in the NHL because your best players are still in their upper 30s. So that's not ideal.
Right.
But there's some good young kids coming in, and there's a possibility that you're on the ascent. And so, I think, that makes it sort of an attractive job. I've taken this question in a different direction, and I feel like I've forgotten the original question. What was it?
Just seeing whether or not this decision was the right time.
Oh yeah. Okay. The timing. Right. Yeah. To me, I've always been, I'm just not a guy. This is my own personality. Anytime a coach gets fired, I feel like it represents an organizational failure to a degree.
Okay.
Like that you brought in a guy that you thought was going to do a good job, and he did do a good job, and it reached the point where it was no longer working. And so I never really think it's something to celebrate. And I think some people sort of look at it that way. And I always think it's something that it's like a necessary evil. Like eventually you have to move on from a coach because you're not seeing the results. And there have been 2 points in the laddered stages of Mike Sullivan's career where I thought maybe it was time. And the first one was Phil Kessel's last year. So that would have I think that was 2018. But they gave up like 12 or 14 shorthanded goals that year. And to me, that's an indication of, like, their guys on the power play, their star players, they just didn't care about taking care of the puck. They were just winging it, trying to score, and they didn't care about the consequences in the other end.
Right.
And that's, to me, is a sign of you're tuning out a coach. And so what they ended up doing in that situation was trading Kessel, who was kind of the ringleader of that mentality. But there were other guys that thought that way. And it helped.
Yeah.
Like, they tightened things up in that respect. This year, with the defense being as bad as it was, like, Erik Karlsson being a big part of that. He's a controversial figure because he's a really good offensive player as a defenseman, but he's a really bad defensive player. And since the title of the job is defenseman, you can see how that might be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he plays makes me think that, like, these guys aren't listening to Sullivan like they did. Like, he's telling them to focus on defense. He's telling them to make sure you have, guys above the puck and don't be making the reckless decisions to try to create offense like you have all the time in the past. Don't pinch into the offensive zone when you should really be retreating and playing defense. And I think that message wasn't getting through all that well. So to me, those were the 2 seasons or you could have said, yeah, maybe a change was in store. But like I said before, I'm always apprehensive about it, just because in general, I think coaching changes should be a last resort, but also because you're getting rid of a really good coach. I mean, how many hockey coaches, how many sports coaches are well-versed in the way the brain learns things?
Right.
Like, to me, you found a really unique dude, because he can do that, but he's also a jock hockey player guy. He also has the deep voice, and it commands attention in a room. And he had pretty much everything you wanted as a coach. Your next guy's not going to have that. So
Absolutely.
you're rolling the dice. You could be voluntarily getting worse at one of the most important positions in your organization. Obviously, they don't plan to do that.
Right.
And obviously, like I said, the staleness is a thing. So I'm not saying that they made the wrong decision. I'm just saying Kyle Dubas is in a tough spot. He has to, the decision he's about to make is a very important one for the future of the franchise. And it's a very important one for the sort of referendum on the kind of job he did. At the end of the day, one of the things a GM can do, people judge him on, is what coach did you hire? And this is his first chance to do that with the Penguins, and he'll be judged. I mean, that's what we do.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of these potential dice rolls. Real briefly, I know, well, we've already touched on what Sullivan could do, but let's talk about where he might potentially end up. Do you see him behind another NHL bench by next season, or are there any teams that you see as good fits?
Yeah, I do think he's, like I said, I think he's competitive. So I don't think he is going to just take that Fenway Sports Group money, the owner of the Penguins. I don't think he's just going to take their money and chill for 2 years. I think there's going to be teams that aggressively pursue him. And I think he's going to take one of those jobs. And it's interesting. Jim Rutherford is the former Penguins GM, is the president in Vancouver now. And he is also looking for a coach. And he said, obviously people put two and two together and say, hey, you're going to hire your old coach, Mike Sullivan, to be the coach in Vancouver.
Right.
And Jim Rutherford is an interesting cat, because he just speaks his mind at press conferences, which most public figures in politics and sports don't do.
Right.
And he just said, yeah, I think Mike Sullivan wants to stay out east, so he's probably not going to be an option for us. So he just blurted that out. And so that sort of limits where Sullivan could end up. Right. I think the two choices, the most obvious choices, are the Rangers and Boston Bruins. He's from Boston, but he already coached the Bruins in his early days, like in the early 2010s, when he was still a young coach, and he was kind of thrown in there, and he didn't really have a great year, didn't really have a great experience. And then he had to take a step back before getting to the Penguins. So I'm not sure. It's a new, that's a generation ago in hockey. So he could go back to the Bruins, but there's something about the Rangers job that I think is right for him. Like, the Rangers job requires, you to stand up to the scrutiny of the press that you get in New York. I think Mike Sullivan's not afraid of that. He's, like I said, he's got that big booming voice and the Boston accent, and he'll stand up there and you can ask him whatever question you want. He's not going to get rattled. And I just think there's something about the Rangers job that really appeals to him. And I think that's, just point blank, I think that's where he's going to end up.
Okay. Well, just a few more questions before we wrap up here. But on this flip side, now the Penguins are in search of a head coach. So do you see any realistic candidates? And for those candidates, what kind of a team are these head coaches going to be walking into with the Penguins next season?
Yeah. It's hard to know exactly what Kyle Dubas is going to look for in a next coach, because he's really, he was the Toronto Maple Leafs GM before he came to the Penguins. And he only really hired one head coach. Sheldon Keefe was a guy. He hired him for the Toronto's AHL team and then promoted him to the NHL team when it was time. That was really the one guy. So we only have one guy to work, to get clues from. Right. And Sheldon Keefe was a guy who came from junior hockey, Canadian junior hockey in the Ontario League. So I think if you're looking at, who Dubas is going to look at, I think that's a place you look. A guy with Ontario Hockey League background, a guy, everybody wants David Carl from University of Denver. He's like the hottest college coach around, right?
Right.
But they treat him real well there. So you're going to have to make him a good offer. It's like college football. Like a great college football coach, to get him to your NFL team, you're going to make him a really good offer. And that's the situation with that guy. But that's the kind of guy, a guy who's young and innovative, I don't think a guy who's been a coach for a long time, people talk about Rick Tocchet, who's available now, a former Penguins player. I don't think a sort of a veteran guy is necessarily the way Kyle Dubas goes. I think he goes with a young guy, maybe a college guy, a junior guy, or a guy coming from the minor leagues who has that kind of, I talked about Sullivan brought that speed and aggressiveness.
Absolutely.
Maybe the next guy who has the next sort of innovative approach. It won't be the same. It won't be the same X's and O's,
right?
But it'll be the same commitment to something new. And I think that's sort of, because this team is getting younger. They're bringing in some prospects. They're bringing in some young players. You mesh that group with the veteran superstars that you have. And if you give them sort of a little edge tactically, you might have something, you're talking about 2 years down the road, you could be a team that starts to contend when Sidney Crosby's 39. I could see that happen. And I think that's probably best case scenario.
Okay. So I have one last question for you. So how different next season do you expect the Penguins team to look?
Well, obviously with a new coach, you're going to have new tactics. So there is going to be a lot of newness to that. I think you're probably going to have some of these young goaltenders. And, that's obviously going to make a big difference because that's, it's the most important position and one of the most important positions in sports. Mm-hmm. And they have two young guys who could theoretically elbow their way into those jobs. The top of the top line, the Sidney Crosby line, the top D pairs are not all that dramatically different. So I think you're not going to see like a complete overhaul. I think Kyle Dubas would like to trade Erik Karlsson. He's a guy that, it hasn't really worked out for the Penguins necessarily. So I think that would be a major sort of facelift. If he can make it happen, he makes $10 million a year. It's not as easy to move him as it sounds.
Right.
I think you're going to see sort of moderate changes from a personnel perspective. And I think you're going to see more changes from a tactical perspective with this new coach. Things are going to look different.
Okay.
And, that's kind of exciting.
Absolutely. Well, Jonathan, thank you for coming on to really give us to use your words, tactical and cerebral look at this latest change within Pittsburgh sports and more specifically the Penguins' inner workings.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zac Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.